Hello, I'm Kaiser and welcome to Moose Reads. Before I get started, I want to say that the opinions that I give here are my own opinions. They are extremely subjective. If I dislike a book, it is not a reflection on the author, and it is not a reflection on people who do like it. Different people have different tastes, and that's okay. Today, I will be reviewing The Umbrella Conspiracy by S.D. Perry. This is the first book in the Resident Evil series. It is a sci-fi horror. The description says, "The Special Tactics and Rescue Squad, STARS, investigate a string of grisly murders in a remote mountain community and discover evidence of a widespread conspiracy." 3 stars. So, if you don't know, Resident Evil is a series of survival horror video games. It's entirely possible that Resident Evil 1 was the first game my other brother ever bought for the PlayStation, and I spent significant chunks of my childhood watching him play. For that reason, despite my general no horror rule, Resident Evil is one of very few exceptions. Even then, I haven't engaged with anything past 6, and I'm not sure it would be a good idea for me. The book series is largely novelizations of the first 3 core games and a game called Code Veronica, which people generally include in the main series despite it not being numbered. Because of the nature of the games and the way Perry adapted them into novels, it's pretty much impossible to talk about the books without talking about the games. That is, incidentally, my first criticism of this first book, which gets it the worst out of all of them. Some people might take it as a given that the people who are going to read the Resident Evil novels have probably already played the games, but I don't think that should be assumed. Even if I had wanted to play the games, which I didn't on account of being a coward and getting creeped out enough without being in the driver's seat, the controls are a little clunky in a way I don't think I could manage, and I've never been good at shooters of any sort anyway. So, while I would imagine most people reading the books are familiar with the games, they also would have been a good way to let people like me experience the story without having to struggle through gameplay. These books will mostly serve that purpose, but not entirely. And yes, I realize that nowadays the solution is to just watch playthroughs online, but that wasn't really an option when any of these books came out. Resident Evil 1 is probably the trickiest case, which I think is also why it suffers from this issue the worst. See, all of the main Resident Evil games have 2 playable characters. In RE1, that's Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. You can start as either, but Jill has more pocket space and starts with a gun, so she's what passes for easy mode. Unlike every other game, however, the story for the 2 characters are distinct, but incompatible. Jill spends more time with a side character named Barry, while Chris eventually teams up with Rebecca, and the things that happen between the 2 pairs are not the same, but everything else is. Worse still, depending on who you choose, the other character has mysteriously vanished at the start of the game, and you learn later that the big bad has imprisoned them throughout. The result is that you can't get the full story without playing both characters, but neither character's story can exist at the same time as the others. This causes 2 problems for someone attempting to adapt the game. First, there's just less content overall, which means there's less story to work with outside of the gameplay. The result is that Perry is forced to include a lot more of the puzzles just to make it novel length, and it's still on the shorter side at 304 pages. Unfortunately, the puzzles are largely tedious backtracking through the mansion and occasionally a bit nonsensical if you consider a real-world scenario rather than a game with limited options. Second, Perry had to figure out how to make both characters active participants in the novel without having them meet up. Both characters spend the first half of the game wandering through the mansion, then on to a guardhouse, and finally an underground lab. So the question becomes, how do 2 people explore a mansion and never run into each other? Mostly, I think Perry handled both problems as well as anyone could, but I do think she made some serious missteps. Certainly, I think she handled splitting the story across both Chris and Jill quite well. There are still some points where it feels a little ridiculous that they never run into each other, but mostly she has them each take half of the mansion and then sends one to the guardhouse and the other to the lab. The puzzles, however, are where it really starts to feel like you're supposed to be familiar with the games in order to get the most out of the story. Like I said, a lot of the puzzles involve backtracking through the mansion to find the piece that goes in the slot that you then have to return to. It's tedious, but when it's a game where the point is to make you traipse through a zombie-infested mansion without getting killed, it works fairly well. In a book, however, it doesn't really work at all. Perry mostly got around this by having characters pick up items they need before they needed them, and not worrying too much about pocket size. She also occasionally just had a side character solve the puzzle while the others were busy. Ultimately, it feels like the puzzles are being alluded to, but not explained. It streamlines the plot a bit, but if you aren't at all familiar with the puzzles being glanced over, you might end up feeling a bit lost as to what's happening. I'm not entirely certain how Perry could have done this better, but even if she chose the best possible method, it still leaves something to be desired. Another thing I didn't like about this book was the number of perspectives utilized to tell the story. To some degree, I understand. There are a number of characters who make brief and infrequent appearances in the game with little to no indication of what they were doing between. Writing chapters from the perspective of the side characters allows the reader to get a more complete picture of events. Unfortunately, that also means that the big reveal that comes late in the game gets spoiled really early on. Again, if you've played the games, you already know, so spoiling isn't a big deal. If you are reading the books without playing the games, however, it completely destroys some major points of tension. The last big thing I didn't care for in this book, which is also a problem I have with the series as a whole, is that Perry seemed determined to make it her own, adding in a character with mysterious motives that doesn't exist outside her books. At the beginning of the novel, just before boarding the helicopter that will take them into the mountains, Jill is approached by this mysterious figure, Mr. Trent, who somehow slipped into the locker room of the police station without being noticed and will presumably slip back out, who gives her a mini computer and some data that will theoretically help her in the mansion. There are a lot of issues I have with Trent in general across the series, but this being his introduction, it irritates me quite a bit more. First, because it's a shit introduction. You learn almost nothing about him, and you won't see him again until the epilogue, which just raises more questions. But more than that, his actions are complete nonsense. He warns Jill not to trust anyone, but will eventually learn that he definitely knew exactly who she shouldn't have trusted, and just didn't tell her anything specific. You could argue that he thought some of the other stars were working with the bad guy in secret, but then you have to wonder how he deemed Jill a safe bet. Jill is an especially poor choice, since it is an open secret that her father, a thief currently in prison, taught her the business before she joined STARS, which means she's already gotten away with crimes and would be the last person on the team an outsider would likely expect to be above working for the criminal organization operating on pharmaceutical money. Then, of course, there's the information he actually gives her. Most of it is vague at best, so Jill looks at it all of once and then never references it again. It kind of tells her the solution to a couple puzzles, but not in any kind of concrete fashion. Other than that, the only useful part of his information packet is a map of the Spencer Mansion, which Jill does reference multiple times. But it's worth noting that that's just on the wall in one of the rooms of the game. Here's the thing. The team wasn't planning to go to the Spencer Mansion to begin with. The murders have been happening in the surrounding area, but if the Stars had run into a couple of zombies and their dogs in the woods and successfully put them down, the case would have been closed. Alternately, the team would have been killed, and all his data would have done is raised a lot of questions for whoever found their corpse. It's also just a map of the mansion. As far as I could tell, it included neither the guardhouse nor the lab that he very much intended for her to find. He also didn't warn her about the zombies. He just sent her on her merry way and hoped. Not a great plan, considering that when they do encounter the dogs in the woods, one of their team members is immediately killed, and it's really just luck that it wasn't Jill. They only end up at the mansion because the dogs start chasing them, and it's the only refuge anywhere near them. On top of that, the zombies and zombie dogs are far from the worst threats they'll encounter in either the mansion or its surrounding buildings. The degree to which Trent's plan relied on luck is obscene, and I hate that Perry went out of her way to insert him. He will, incidentally, get much worse as the series goes on. That's all I have to say about the Umbrella Conspiracy. If you like this video, I hope you'll watch more in the future. Thanks for watching this one. Bye!